welcome to everyone. And I will begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I meet. I know that many of you are on lands right across New South Wales, possibly, and even beyond. And that on the lands where I sit, it's the Gadigal and Vice-Regal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. It is a great pleasure today to be presenting this seminar in conjunction with the Historic Houses Association. And we have done a number of events with the association. This is the first one we've done on Zoom, so it really is a great pleasure. We have three fantastic speakers today. It is going to be a real joy, excuse the pun there. Our first speaker will be Carol Liston, and Carol is the Senior Vice President of the RAHS. She also wrote the introduction to the publication, Playing Their Part, and she has had a long and distinguished career, still is enjoying a long and distinguished career as an academic historian. Joy Hughes is a researcher par excellence, and Joy and Carol are both co-editors of the publication, and Joy is going to speak to us today about two of the essays. And our third speaker is Bruce Baskerville, and Bruce is joining us from Western Australia. Thank you, Bruce. And Bruce is also going to speak about some of the essays in the that have appear in the book. And it is going to be, I think, a fantastic hour and a half.
Welcome everybody to our talk about a really interesting project that we had the opportunity to work on. When General David Hurley and Mrs. Hurley were in residence at Government House, Sydney, Mrs. Hurley approached the Royal Australian Historical Society to find out about her predecessors. She and her family had moved into Government House, but had very little idea of who had been there previously and what their responsibilities were. So here we were in the middle of the second decade, really, almost, of the 21st century, in a 19th century house, in a role that had been going for nearly 200 years. And it raised the question of who were the predecessors, who else had been in her position, a really unusual position. Other parts of the world recognise that the wives and partners of their leaders, whether leaders in power or figureheads, had something of a public role that could be recognised. And we see it most clearly in the United States of America, where the Smithsonian has for long had galleries that recorded the histories of the First Ladies, the wives of the presidents of the United States. And they did that in a number of ways, by collecting a gown for each woman, by collecting the dinner service that had been used in the official residences, and really making a point that this was a role for women and a role that had changed over time in the public life of the United States of America. In Australia, we're not so good at recognising that women had a role to play in the 19th century. And for the Royal Australian Historical Society, this was a real opportunity to look behind the administration of New South Wales and to see and document the history of women who were always there, but very often in the shadows. And of course, as we moved through history, it became clear it wasn't just wives, it was wives, daughters, sisters, and by the 20th century, husbands. So here was a role that was changing. So the Vice-Regal Consort is the partner of the Governor of New South Wales. It is a role that has no job description and no salary. And yet, in many ways, the identity of that partner was often essential in terms of making the appointment of who the governor was. For most of the 19th century, you could not have been a colonial governor without a wife. And who that wife was often an integral part of your, as a man, your social status and career opportunities. And so thinking of that, we had an enormous canvas on which we could write the lives of the many women and one man who fulfilled the role in New South Wales. And so for most of them, yes, they are women. And the roles were a combination of public and private. In most instances, they were there as wife and supporter of the governor, but many of the women were also mothers, sometimes mothers of very young children. They had an important role in maintaining the governor's household. Yes, there were servants, but it was the consort who managed the life in Government House. Most importantly of all, it was the role as social hostess that was absolutely critical. Beyond that, and perhaps an extension of the role of hostess, was that as fashion icon. The comments on the clothes that the women wore were constant, from the daughter of Governor Bligh appearing in church in a semi-transparent dress, through to a comment in the 20th century that one of the consorts had actually let her petticoat show. You could not get away from the public exposure that came from the role. For much of the time, the Vice-Regal Consort was a leading philanthropist, a leader in terms of supporting the charities of the day. And she also increasingly became an advocate for issues. And my colleagues Bruce and Joy will be talking in much more detail about some of the women and the way some of these roles were played out. But what I'd like to do is just briefly go through the implications for some of these roles. One of the things I think we don't stop and think about was who got appointed as governor and how this changed through the 19th and into the 20th century. And it almost falls quite evenly, for those of us who aren't very good with dates, into sort of 50-year periods. So that for the first part of our history, from 1788, when the first fleet arrived, through to self-government in 1856, the reality was this was an outpost of crooks. It was a jail. It was slowly becoming a free colony with immigration, and then suddenly it got really rich with gold. So this was a place where it was quite appropriate for naval men in the beginning, and then for soldiers to be the governors. In the case of their wives, for many of the naval men, their wives were quite accustomed to staying at home. Some of them went on the ships with them, some of them didn't. And similarly, the military governors were often appointed because of their previous experience, and the identity of their wives was less significant than it became later in the century. The first clue that this might change is probably with the appointment of Governor Fitzroy, where both he and his wife were extremely eminent members of the British aristocracy. And that was a sign of something to come. With self-government in 1856, going through to when the colonies federated in 1901, what we start to see is the growth of Victoria's empire. This was where, I suppose, in the final years of the British aristocracy, there was a real role for them as imperial governors. They were representing Queen Victoria And the appointments that came at that time were, I think to our surprise when we were doing the book, women of extraordinarily high aristocratic lineage. These were people close to Victoria's elite, and they and their husbands came to New South Wales as governors. The situation changed with Federation because instead of the Governor of New South Wales being the top dog, suddenly there was a Governor General. And that appointment now, of course, is based in Canberra. But in the first instance, it was based in Sydney. And so the Governor had to move out of Government House into Cranbrook as a secondary residence. And what we see in the early decades of the 20th century with Federation is whilst the more aristocratic appointments become the Governor General, what we see in the appointments to New South Wales are personal friends of the changing monarchs of Edward and George, men they'd met in their naval careers, and increasingly professional diplomats, men with their wives who had been to a number of other colonies, who brought with them extensive experience of other parts of the British Empire. Well, of course, the Second World War changed all of that experience, changed all of that sense of being British, as Australia, as one of the dominions, became much more self-confident about its own identity, and where there was an increasingly loud requirement that the governors be Australian. And of course, Australian appointees were obviously not aristocratic. They tended in the post-war period to be very much back to that safe appointment of military governors. And it's really only as we enter the 21st century that we start to see that the role of governor, and therefore of the consort, has changed dramatically to allow the civil professions to be represented and for women to be governors. So that the world that our vice-regal consorts were in prior to the 21st century is a world that is now past. So perhaps one of the most important components of the role of the vice-regal consort was as social leader. And here we can see it by just comparing the situations of Elizabeth Macquarie, wife of the colonial governor Lachlan Macquarie, consort from 1810 to 1821. And Lady Jersey, Margaret Charles Villiers, consort of Lord Jersey in the 1890s, 1891 to 1893. For those of us who know something of our Australian history, we know that the Macquaries got into terrible strife because of their support for ex-convicts, for in fact opening up the vice-regal household to people who had been criminals, and in the case of Elizabeth, to women who may not have been married by the church to the men they called their husbands. This was breaking social expectations in an enormously controversial way. And we can see that in the political coverage of the Macquarie period. Go to the end of the 19th century, and in Lady Jersey, we see encapsulated not only an extremely elite woman in terms of her connections, someone who could share morning tea with the daughter of the Queen, but someone who was very, very conservative. She was against women getting the vote, but more importantly, her social role was such that for she and her daughters, not only was she chaperoned by her husband, but in order to be able to return to the royal household, she had her brother in attendance as well, so that she was free to travel without her husband and still be appropriately chaperoned. Her sense of what is socially right extended to the fact of refusing entry to the Premier of New South Wales because his wife, second wife, had been his mistress and was therefore socially unacceptable. This was a woman who took the role of social leader in New South Wales as a very staunch position of what that role should be. One of the things I doubt we'll see in the future is the notion of a family of young people at Government House. In the 19th century, the consorts were often young women still of childbearing age, such as Lady Carrington, who had a baby here in New South Wales, or the Hamptons and others who brought with them a clutch of children of differing ages, and that Government House needed to be able to be a family home as well as a place of public entertainment. For the governors of New South Wales, their staff provided opportunities for older sons, for brothers, for mates who needed jobs, all of whom would join the paid staff at Government House. But I think the 19th century and the 20th century that we document in the book is again of a passing world. For Australian governors appointed in the future, it would be extremely unlikely that we would get a vice-regal family of childbearing years. Of course, some consorts came here knowing what the job was because they came with husband, but they also died. Perhaps the best known of the wives of the governors who died in tragic circumstances was Lady Mary Fitzroy, killed in her tragic carriage accident at Parramatta. But her husband could not continue as governor in any sense of respectability, and even then probably not very respectable. And they had to bring out her daughter and her whole family to act as consort for Governor Fitzroy once his wife had died. And Mary Caroline Stewart is here, but almost unmentioned, even when she turns the first sod of the railway line. Other daughters came into the role because of the deaths of their mothers. They had very little choice but to step up, as Alice Rawson did, to be her father's hostess at Cranbrook in the early years of the 20th century. Here's a young woman who, with her father, would stand and shake the hands of 3,500 people at a reception in the grounds of Cranbrook. Little choice, but done very elegantly. And well, we know the great houses that represent the governors of New South Wales, from first Government House in Sydney to Government House, the current Government House. And I suppose we expect that the government paid for it. But think of the homes in which many of these women came from. This is Madraville, the home of the Ligon family, Ligon family that Bruce will talk more about. This is a grand house. These women came from extraordinary backgrounds. And because of that, they came from very strictly controlled social backgrounds. Most of the women, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, came from narrowly confined society where they mixed only with people from their own social group. As we document in the book, the women were often of higher social status than their husbands, and it's often their social status that gets their husband the job. We have amongst these women the granddaughters of peers of the realm. We also have women who, whose grandparents were the new moneyed elite, the new British aristocracy of industry. They knew how to manage great households, to have domestic staff sorted, to host the social events. But what we didn't really know was that the governors were expected to pay out of their salaries the household expenses and the cost of entertaining at Government House. That meant the clothing that everyone wore, the food, the extra servants, And for many of those governors who thought they could come to New South Wales and save their money, so they found that their salaries were not sufficient for the costs. They bought so much furniture with them, they couldn't afford to take it home, which I'm sure is a delight to the antique dealers today. And I think that's my time.